Genesis is an historical account and not an explanation of mechanism, at least in the sense of natural law. And it provides mechanism in the sense that God intervenes and does what he pleases, at times he chooses, but that violates the uniformitarianism principle of science, and so that's not science. Moreover, Genesis is very ambiguous. It is a very sparse account of what are purported to be two of the most profound events in history, the creation and the Great Flood. Even setting aside the arguments over the meanings of specific words translated from ancient Hebrew texts, it leaves broad latitude for interpretation. This makes the Genesis hypothesis difficult to test, and so a priori we seem to be on the margin of science. In contrast, neo-Darwinism is very precisely formulated, even in a body of mathematical formulations called population genetics. There are specific things natural selection can and cannot do, and specific changes in genes and gene frequencies that can and cannot happen. This is what Feynman referred to as making the computations based on the guess. It's very difficult to make the computations based on Genesis because it is so vague. It's very easy to make them based on neo-Darwinism. But even though I think it's very difficult to test the Genesis hypothesis because of its ambiguity, let's do the best we can. The fossil record. The fossil evidence is not the most important evidence in evaluating evolution theory. Nonetheless, it does exist, and neo-Darwinism makes specific predictions about patterns in the fossil record. For example, there should be a stratigraphy, what Kent referred to as the stratigraphic column, an ordering of older, more primitive forms at the bottom and more recently, more derived forms at the top. The Genesis hypothesis is not explicit about the fossil record, but as I understand Kent's interpretation, there is a single massive bout of extinction resulting from the Noachian flood. Accordingly, there should be no particular stratigraphy. There should be a single stratum, or if there are multiple strata where organisms were sorted according to weight, habitat, or intelligence, the strata should all be of the same age, namely roughly 4,400 years. The fossil record is, to my knowledge, wholly consistent with neo-Darwinism in terms of classic stratigraphy and also in terms of modern radiometric dating, and also, although these data and this type of analysis is very much in process right now, the stratigraphic column is also consistent with dates based on the molecular clock. There was an article to that effect in a recent issue of Nature. In contrast, the stratigraphy itself and the radiometric dates of fossil-bearing strata stretching back more than 3 billion years are completely inconsistent with the Genesis hypothesis. And in the metaphysical system of science, the Genesis hypothesis simply is falsified if, in fact, the Earth and the fossil-bearing strata are older than 6,000 years. Biogeography. One of my favorite topics. The theory of evolution predicts that there should be strong correspondence between phylogenies, that is, the evolutionary histories of species, and geological events. For example, there should be relationships at deep levels in phylogenies of animals in South America with animals in Africa because the two continents formed a single supercontinent some 80+ million years ago, according to modern geological theory, specifically continental drift. And there should be a more recent set of relationships with animals of North America, that is between North America and South America, because South America contacted North America through the Isthmus of Panama just 3.5 million years ago. And according to evolution theory, there was an interchange of numerous species and the evolution of species in South America from ancestors emanating from North America and vice versa. If you've ever seen a possum, and I'm sure most of you have that live in the metropolitan Detroit area, that is one North American species whose ancestors live in South America. And this biogeographic pattern, which corresponds very, very tightly with geological history, is exactly the pattern observed. It is exactly the pattern that neo-Darwinism would predict, and it is essentially confirmed. The Genesis theory, in contrast, says little or nothing about biogeographic pattern at this scale, and so it doesn't serve us very well as a scientific hypothesis or theory. Phylogenetic reconstruction. Based on the supposition that evolution has occurred, evolutionary biologists have devised rather simple methods for reconstructing evolutionary history or phylogenies. And I certainly admit immediately this assumes that evolution has occurred, and if it hasn't, we couldn't do this. A phylogeny is a branching diagram, a family tree that shows who is related to whom and the order in which species evolve. According to the theory of evolution, the branching order of phylogenies should correspond with the stratigraphic order of the fossil record and with the history of geological events. The data from the fossil record is, of course, incomplete, and for technical reasons, we are not able to reconstruct accurate phylogenies for all groups. Science always has a lot of holes. But the overall pattern very strongly corroborates this prediction. In contrast, the Genesis hypothesis says that all species arose, originated within a short period of time as disconnected acts of special creation. If this were the case, we wouldn't be able to reconstruct phylogenies at all. This is clearly not the case. Homology. The concept of homology is one of the most important in evolutionary biology. It is based on the idea, clearly articulated by Darwin, that according to the theory of evolution, all structures, anatomical, genetical, even functions and behaviors, must have evolved from previously existing structures in a common ancestor. These species that's a tough one to get out. These species should share similar structures because they all inherited them modified by evolution from a common ancestral structure. Such structures are said to be homologous. This pattern of homology, as predicted by Darwin, pervades the full spectrum of life. Classically, it is known from comparative anatomy and embryology, for example, as radically different as the avian wing is from the vertebrate forelimb, as Kent's illustration showed. The major bones are homologous, and each can be traced to the same embryonic origin and to homologous bones in fossil forms. When molecular genetics arrived some 20 or so years ago, it provided one of the most critical and exhaustive tests of the theory of evolution. Specifically, we ought to find pervasive homology among genes, bearing